Okay. Maciel Des, welcome to LATINX Scan.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you asking me to come on your podcast.
I'm super excited, and your story is very, very interesting. It's a little different from the stories that we typically have in the podcast. So I'm super excited to have you here. So let's start a little by talking about where you come from. What's your story? Where does your story begin?
Okay, so I was born on a small island called San Andres, which belongs to Colombia. But at the age of 4, we left. My mother and I immigrated to Canada in the French part of Canada, which is Montreal in Quebec. And that's kind of where I grew up. And I went to university there, McGill University in Montreal, and I studied chemical engineering.
Awesome. And so, what was life growing up, in Canada, coming from San Andres, which is a little Caribbean island, and then moving to Canada, which is really cold? How was that transition for you? And also, what was life like for you and your mom?
Yeah, when people ask me this, I feel bad in a way because I think with the hardest part of moving fell on my mother, not on me. As a child, I think as a kid you don't really realize what's happening, your surroundings, and for my mom, who was an adult, she was 35, I believe, when we moved. It was very difficult for her. She didn't speak the language, not only not English, but French, so two languages that she had to overcome. And I think what was very difficult for her and a lot of immigrants who have bachelors or masters or, they have a profession, when you arrive to another country, they don't necessarily, you know, let you work. You have to
Yep.
go back to school and recredit all this stuff. And so unfortunately, a lot of professionals do move for a better life, but they realize that they have to go back to school, and
Yeah.
nobody has money to go back to school in these
Yeah.
countries. And you have a family, and you're older now, and so that's a big challenge that a lot of immigrants face. And for my mom, education was always a huge deal. I think that's probably why I was pushed into engineering or medicine or lawyer. Typical immigrant story.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have to become somebody, and it's got to have a degree. And so she decided to go back to school, actually. So she learned French, English, and about 10 years into us being in Canada, she went back to school to restudy her degree. And so I grew up with her. No matter all the challenges that came her way, she wanted
Right.
that degree so badly. And so when it was my turn, I had no choice but to go
Yeah.
to the top university in Canada and make sure that I made her proud.
Yeah, yeah. I think your story resonates so much. In my experience, I'm the immigrant, right? So I'm the one that is. I think even growing up in at home, my mom was an engineer, my dad was an engineer, my sister was an engineer. I deviated a little bit and said, well, I'm gonna become a chemist, but still, STEM related. And
Totally.
there's a lot of children of immigrant that say, oh, but I want to pursue arts. My mother and my father, they want me to pursue engineering or become a lawyer or things like that. So it's very relatable. And for you, I think you've mentioned also that when your parents move, you're a little kid, right? Like your whole role is just to grow up because you don't get the burden of the responsibility of having moved, but you do get the burden of that expectation
Yeah.
of having your parents, say, we moved here for you. We moved here to give you opportunities, and we expect you to do something, to become something, so that my sacrifices are worth it. And that's a huge pressure to have. Now, how do you deal with that kind of pressure? And with the benefit of hindsight now, how do you think your life would have been different if you didn't have that kind of pressure?
I think it's a healthy pressure that some parents push their children into having big dreams for them, right? Like they want you to be successful, they want you to do better than they did, they want you to set up your life financially for your own future because they left everything behind, and so it's for you to rebuild it. And so there comes a lot of pressure, to your point of you have to have top grades and you have to be really good, you have to go to top school, and you need a STEM degree. But when I look at it, I think it was so beneficial that I grew up that way. Versus, I've met a lot of very successful people who have great jobs and very good financially, and their children were not driven at all to acquire any of that success or even work hard because everything was given to them.
Yeah.
And you see their children now, and they didn't do anything with their life, and they're just waiting on mom and dad. And so when I saw that, I realized that all the challenges that I had to go through made me a better person and made me stronger. And at the end of the day, I'm very grateful for having that immigrant story, because nothing came easy. We didn't have a lot of money. It was always a struggle to even have a house. The first house that my mom was ever able to buy, I was 16 years old. And so before that, we always rented these little crappy apartments or lived with family. And so, it's just like these big milestones that I remember in my head of like, we had a house when I was 16. And so I think all of those things just made me a better person, and I think are the driver of why I've been so hungry to do well in my own career and my life.
Yeah. I think that's a nice perspective to bring to the table, because every time I hear this story of, my parents are putting so much pressure on me, I wish I didn't have to do that. It's valid, I think, not to have to live to somebody else's expectations, but at the same time, realize that there are a lot of opportunities, and, your parents just want you to try and take advantage of those opportunities that you did have, and was the
Yeah.
reason why they made all those sacrifices.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. I think I've seen both sides where, to your point, you mentioned this earlier, you wanted to be in art or you wanted to do something else, but your parents pushed you into a different direction. And I think a lot of people may grow up with like that anger of I didn't do what I wanted. So it's very valid. I think for me, what's been interesting is since a young kid, I always wanted to be an actress. Like I wanted to go to Hollywood, or I wanted to have a YouTube channel. Like I would have my mom go bring me to like auditions for modeling and all this stuff. And they were always like, you're too short. Like you don't fit the thing. And so
Yeah.
my dreams were broken very early. But what was interesting is my mom always still pushed me into making sure that I wanted things that I wanted to do, but it was always like, having an education is really important, but if you want to do this, I'll support you, I'll bring you to auditions, but always with that STEM degree importance on the side. And I think, what I've done now is I became an engineer, I have a career, but I still fulfilled that hobby of like YouTube, being on camera, having a podcast, being on social media. So I was able to balance both, and I think maybe that's why it worked out, because
Yeah.
I didn't give one up.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think when you just mentioned you wanted to become an actor, the first thing I heard is you kind of are living that dream a little bit as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later in the conversation. But then you just mentioned that, also immigrant parents usually want their kids to be an engineer, a lawyer, quote unquote, you have a quote unquote stable career, right? But then the challenge becomes that how do those children find out how to become an engineer or a lawyer when their parents don't have the experience to having gone through university in the new country, right? That was very much your experience. Your mom had both a bachelor's and a master's degree from Colombia, but when it came to Canada, she didn't really know the system, right? You became an engineer anyway, went to McGill, studied chemical engineering. How do you figure out how to become an engineer, then a field engineer in the oil field, and how has your career developed since?
So, what I find interesting about immigrant children who do end up having, a STEM degree and go work in corporate America is we do have a little bit of a disadvantage. And I think you and I were talking about this before, where I didn't hear my mom or family members ever speak about like meetings or New York with all the financial and stocks, investments, CEOs, like that. The corporate life just for me was not a thing that I knew existed. And most of my family all worked like minimum wage jobs or hourly, kind of working outside type of thing. So when it came into me going into corporate, I didn't have that family member. Like a lot of people get to hear their parents talk at the dinner table of like meetings and just so many different things that help you develop, and they can share experiences with their children too of like what to do when you have a bad manager in the corporate world, how to XXX, how to move internationally, all these big opportunities that you get that a lot of parents like my mom, they didn't know that, and so there was a little bit of that disadvantage. But you kind of I've been learning through trial and errors and just like first generation of going into corporate. And then to your point, in terms of the university, luckily it was just asking friends of how they do it, because the process is hard, right? All
Yeah.
the applications and interviews or going to school, the funds, like a lot of parents take care of that for their
Yeah.
kids, right?
Yeah.
They already have funds set up, they already know the professors, they know the school, they go do university visits, all this stuff that I didn't have. It was just, like I said, everything was a first type of experience. Lucky I had a lot of friends who were going through the same process, and maybe their parents kind of helped them. And so
Yeah.
I acquired information from other people. But definitely, I think a lot of Latinos or immigrants will relate, that you were kind of the first one being thrown into the fire.
Yeah, the Shark Tank. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think what you mentioned is what I hear from what you mentioned is you had a community of friends that you could rely on, right? And I see myself reflected in it a little bit because applying to college wasn't, I had a good support system that helped me apply to college. So I kind of just made it through. And but when I was in college, I was like, okay, what do I do? I mean, the first year I did diving as a sport, so I didn't really have a lot of free time. So it was really just studying and going and doing diving. Then after that, I decided to quit after my first year, and I had all this free time. My summers were free all of a sudden, right? And I'm like, what do I do with all this time? And I remember one time I volunteered at a camp for children with disabilities in Florida. And the reason why I found that opportunity was because my friend had found the opportunity. And I asked him, oh, what are you going to do this summer? He's a Colombian friend, actually. And he's like, oh, I'm not going back to Colombia. I'm going to volunteer at this camp. And I'm like, ooh, volunteering. Maybe I should volunteer for this camp. And then I was like, what's the information? Let me write it down. And so really that was also how I kind of just found the opportunities that I needed. And I just made my way through.
Yeah, it's all about sharing, to your point, and just community. You're not alone. There's thousands of other people going through the same thing you are, so sharing experiences is definitely very important.
Yeah. So you became a field engineer and you started working in the oil and gas industry, right? And one of the things that, I see from having met you a couple of months ago and almost a year ago, actually, heard about you and your podcast and everything that you're doing. Right now, you're recognized as a leader in your industry. You have achieved financial stability, and you're a strong advocate for women in the oil field. So I think it's safe to say that your mom's sacrifices were worth it, right? Like you became something. But there aren't a lot of people that follow that same story, right? I think, especially for children of immigrants, sometimes, and I do want to acknowledge this because we just talked about it, it's hard to get a college education. It's difficult. There are many barriers. It's expensive. You don't see examples of it in your family. So you're the first one that has to navigate through the struggles. So I know it's hard, but sometimes people choose or make the choice one way or another to not put that extra effort, maybe get a part-time job, maybe get I don't know, maybe a job as an assistant somewhere and get a little bit of money and say, well, this is probably enough. I'm already doing better than people in my country.
Yeah.
That was not your story, but you have had examples of that in your own story, in your own life. So I wonder, what was the difference for you? What was the driver for you to put in that extra effort, that extra sacrifice to get to where you are right now?
So I think growing up as an immigrant and not coming from a lot, and seeing just my mom and family members work so hard in a new country to make ends meet, to take their family, move, leave everything behind. Like they did so much sacrifices to get ahead in life that like really any challenge that came my way as a adult or even when I was choosing school or when I went into degree for me was really like nothing when I had such big examples of my family that actually suffered and actually had to work very hard. You know, my mom had 3 jobs, my uncles, my aunts, they all had multiple jobs in order to make it work, you know. And I started working when I was 16 because I also needed money. It's not like
Yeah.
they could buy my books. It's not like, you know. So I just had this work ethic from a very young age. From the second I could work, I had multiple jobs in the summer, 2 or 3. I would fill my entire day, start at 6, finish at midnight. When most kids would, you know, have fun in the summer and get an allowance. Like, that wasn't for me. And I think it just became a habit for me. Like, I created a habit early on that I need to use my time very well and make the most that I can with it, because I know time is very valuable, and I don't want to waste a single day when I could be working towards a dream or a goal. And so I brought that all the way through my adulthood. And so when I started working as a field engineer in the oil and gas industry, truly the only reason at the beginning why I joined the oil and gas industry was because of the money. It was, for me, a path to financial stability that maybe I couldn't get in another industry. So truthfully, that was the only reason initially that I said I want to go into it. Yeah. So I had an internship, and I went to work up north in Alberta in the fracking business. And I started talking with my colleagues, you know, the guys out in the field who didn't have a college degree, most of them, you know, the hardworking people who are working outside in the field. And they were all making, you know, 6 figures. And I was like, 6 figures? Yeah. Wow, this is like, you've made it in life. Like, that for me was like mind-blowing 6 figures. And I was like, you don't have a college degree? Like, what? How are people making this kind of money? Like, I was just not used to that. I was used to people in Montreal just like barely making, you know, $30,000 a year and like making it work. And so after I finished my internship, I said, I need to go back to that. I don't care what job it is. Like, I need to go make that kind of money, because I know that that's what's going to help me and help my mom, help my family. And like, for me, I was very focused on the financial success of it. Yeah. And so when I went back and I started working as a field engineer, I mean, it's a very difficult job. It's 24/7. You're out in the field, cold weather, snowing, thunderstorm, heat, you name it, you're outside. And it's not easy because you are responsible for multi-million dollars worth of work. And they kind of throw you out there very young after you finish school. And but that's why they pay you very well. And so it's not like, oh, I was just getting paid really well. It was like I was sacrificing my 20s. I did not have a life from 22 to 27. I was working in the field for 5 years. I had no life. I missed birthdays. I missed, you know, Christmas, Thanksgiving, you name it. But again, I think it would always stem back from like, I want to do really well. Like, I want to. So for me, it's always just been about drive and hard work and thinking about like, I'm going to set the foundation so that later in life I could relax or enjoy a little bit better. But you know, a lot of it came from a lot of hard work. It hasn't been easy, but I'm the kind of person that's willing to put in the 24 hours worth of work.
Yeah, you've seen everybody put in the 24 hours worth of work, right? So it's following on a very, very good example. But I'm curious, you know, when you learn about those people without a college degree having a 6-figure salary, didn't it cross your mind to say, well, why do I go back to and finish my degree? Let me just finish here and then just start making money now.
Look, I thought about that. I was in my last year, actually, when I had that internship, so I really had like 8 months left and I was going to graduate, so I was like, I might as well get it. But I called all my cousins and my uncles back home, and I was like, guys, come work in the oil field. Come to Alberta. Come, they will hire you if they need labor. But I told them it's hard conditions, you're out there, you're going to miss birthdays, seeing your kids, you're away from home, so you're getting paid for a lot of sacrifice. But I called everybody and I was like, this is it. You guys can come have a living. The thing is, a lot of people aren't willing to do what it takes. They don't want to sacrifice. They want to be comfortable and they're okay. You know, and some people will, but some other people will see that as an opportunity and say, I'm going to go work for 2 years and buy a house. And, so everybody to each their own. But I think the difference of having a degree, which is very valuable, is that unfortunately, if you work in the field, and you're getting paid very well, you're going to stay in the field forever or for a very long time. You're going to be a worker, you know. Yeah. With having a degree, you work in the field for a few years, you get experience, but then you get to go into the office and move up in management and do business and kind of grow a career. where you're home, life is more stable. You can end up making more money eventually in a long career. So I think, if you have a STEM degree, it's a lot better long term.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing I just want to sort of highlight that you just said, because I really like what you said, is you were setting the foundation to be then more comfortable later on in life. And when I see my experience and I talk to my friends in here in the States, a lot of my friends are from grad school, so we all met really actually having a quite hard, miserable life to being grad students. It's not glamorous to be a grad student. You make $20,000 a year, which is enough to survive. And then you again work for 20 hours. So
Yeah.
it's not the easiest thing to do. But when we think about it, a lot of us are immigrants from Venezuela. So it's one, the only choice we have to maybe think to stay in the country later on, find a job, and then be able to have our visas and green cards and things like that. But then the other thing is, we put it in the sacrifice today, so in 10, 20 years we can be comfortable and have a more comfortable life and live the dream that we're sacrificing today.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And so in 2000, so you started working as a field engineer with Schlumberger, now SLB, in 2013,
Yes.
around that time, right? And then in 2016, you got an opportunity to move to the US from Canada. And the company relocated you and your family to Texas. I think these corporate relocations, exterior assignments or whatever they want to call them, are good opportunities that are often available in these multinational companies, right? What was that experience for you being relocated by the company from Canada to the US, and both personally and professionally?
So, when I joined the company, one of the reasons was because they said your career is global. And they were telling you in the interview and in the recruiting process that you will be moved around the world. And like, you need to be comfortable with that. And I remember thinking, like, I want to be an expat. I love traveling. So I'm not tied to Canada. I would love to live in different parts of the world. But of course, that becomes difficult after when you have a family, when you have a husband or a wife who, isn't working for the same company. And so that part got a little bit more difficult. So the reason I stayed in Canada for the first 5 years was because my husband's Canadian and he didn't necessarily want to move. And so even though the company could have offered me an international role at the time, it just didn't work for the family. So when we got the opportunity to move to Houston, we jumped on it, mainly because it was a big city. And so it wasn't like an oil town and like remote area. So I worked for him and his business. And we had already been in Canada for 5 years since I graduated. And so we saw this as it's a good opportunity. And to your point, I find when you get to work for a global company where you get to relocate, it's truly a gift because it gives you such a big perspective on the rest of the world and working in other countries and areas that you would have never been exposed to. New challenges, new cultures, new teamwork. It's so different. And truly, I tell everybody, if you can do an international role, do it because you will grow a lot from it. And so when we moved from Canada to the US, it worked out really well in the sense that Canada to US is not that different. Same language, very similar culture. And so it was a very good move for us. But, Mexico is a little bit harder.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that's also very different is because you could say, why do I need to go and live in a different country if I can just travel and then I'll get exposed that way? But the difference in really being in the country is that you get to experience the culture and you have to not only experience it, but you need to adapt to the culture and deal with a culture that is different than yours. And it really brings that different perspective, right? Were you seen though as an expat when you started working? What was your perception of how your colleagues perceived you?
When I moved from Canada to Texas, no, they all thought I was from Texas. When I told them I was Canadian, they're like, "You're Canadian?" I think they really thought I was like a Tex-Mex or like I look like a lot of people in Texas, I guess. And because I don't have a strong Canadian accent, nobody thought that I was any different. So in terms of blending in, it was super easy.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was really no big difference between Canada and US.
Yeah. And do you see sort of like an improvement in your professional life, or do you see the benefits in your professional career in that time frame?
Yes, so when I was in Canada, I was in the field. When I came to Texas, I was in the field for about a year, but then I got to move into the office. And so
Mm-hmm.
where there was a big change wasn't so much the country and the environment, but it was the work setting, right? It was the first time that I was in corporate. It was the first time I went to an
Mm-hmm.
office. I was used to just wearing coveralls, and the
Mm-hmm.
language is very different, how you speak to, your friends and operators out in the field versus like big bosses and people in suits. And so even then I had to adjust my environment of not just being Canada to Texas, but being field to office. And so
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of learnings, and it's two different worlds, and so I had to get used to it, and going to an office every single day, and like sitting in your little cubicle, and so that part was different. But in terms of career growth, huge career growth in terms of location, because Houston's the hub. So if you get to go to the
Mm-hmm.
headquarters of where your company is placed,
Mm-hmm.
you get to do a lot of good networking of people who would have never known who you were if you were still in Canada, if you were in another country. So I think going to Houston for me was a huge career boost and opportunity, because I got to network with a lot of people that had no idea who I was when I was up in Canada.
Yeah, that's a great sort of learning from that first experience, right? And then a little over 5 years later, then you get another opportunity to relocate, right, with the company. And this time you mentioned it was to Mexico. So in 2022, after the pandemic, you moved to Villahermosa, and this was your first time actually living as an adult in Latin America. And I watched this one. You have a very strong presence on social media, and you're very candid. And I watched one of the videos that you did at the end of 2022. It was like your year in review kind of thing. And you mentioned that that move to Mexico was actually a bit hard because you thought you were going to fit in because you identify as a Colombian, you were raised very Colombian, right? And so you felt like, oh, I'm just gonna go in and it's gonna be fine. I speak the language. But people saw you a little differently, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
Yes. So when they told me that the opportunity was in Mexico, I was super excited because I love Mexico. I had been to a few parts of Mexico. I got married in Cancun, so I was like, oh, I love Mexico. And also for me, it was like it's right across the border. Like, how different could it be? We're right beside each other. And so, to your point, I had just been on vacation to a resort and like a few cities, but I had never lived and immersed into the culture. And so that was a huge, just for me, culture shock in a way, because I didn't think it was that different, but it's very different.
Hmm.
And so another thing too is like, I was like, I will easily blend in. I look Mexican, I'm Colombian, I speak Spanish, I grew up Colombian, I'm a Latino. Like, I've always identified as a Latino, and I'm super proud of it. But when I came here, I realized that maybe I wasn't what I thought I was for so many years. It was like a little bit of a wake up call, because I had never lived in Latin America since I was 4 years old. And so even little things like the airport or the planes leaving 30 minutes late, and it's just the customer service is not what it is, and just so many things that I could write like a book on that are so different that I just didn't know were different, because I was
Yeah.
so used to living in a bubble in North America that I was frustrated at the beginning because things weren't going my way. I was like, I just wasn't used to everything that was happening, how complicated things were. Even just to take out your driver's license, it was like, what? I have to do all of this for a driver's license? And so my mom, I remember she sat me down and she said, you've never lived in Latin America. Like, you're not Latino. Like, I know you think you are, but you're more Canadian than you are Colombian. And it was hard for me, because I was like, when people ask me where I'm from, I'm Colombian. I'm Latino. I never say I'm Canadian, because I don't identify as Canadian. But I realized that at the end of the day, a lot of who I am is where I grew up.
Yeah.
And so that part was difficult. It was like a rude awakening when I got here. And to your point, I think what was difficult at the beginning was blending in with my new colleagues, when they didn't see me as someone who was Mexican or somebody who was Latino. It was like they really thought I was American. And so, of course, when somebody's different and they're coming to your country, already you have a little bit of like, you have to get the buy-in and kind of, get the confidence that and build that trust. But
Yeah.
also when they don't think you're Latino, it's also even harder. And so for me,
Yeah.
it was difficult because I thought it was going to be so easy. But in
Mm.
reality, it took me almost 6 7 months to finally feel like they felt like I was Latino. And
Yeah.
so that part was difficult. And also just wanted to add is my Spanish. I was fluent, so when the company asked me, "Do you speak Spanish?" I'm like, "Of course, I've spoken Spanish
Mm-hmm.
my entire life." What I
Mm.
didn't realize is that I only spoke Spanish at home or with
Yeah.
family members, and it's
Mm-hmm.
very different when you're in a work setting, presenting technology, talking engineering terms, oil field terms to
Mm-hmm.
customers. And I quickly realized within a week, even when I was talking to people, my English would come out. And I was like,
Yeah.
I just wasn't used to it because I had never been challenged to speak in Spanish for a whole week or
Yeah.
for a full day with other people that weren't my family. And
Yeah.
so I realized like my Spanish is not that good. And writing and reading, even though is a pretty easy language in a way to learn, I didn't write very well. So my emails, people
Mm.
probably were like, "Man, her Spanish is like a 5 year old writing
Yeah.
emails to
Mm.
customers." And so trust me, it was a big adjustment. I
Yeah.
learned so much from 2022, but I'm not someone that sugarcoats things. I just wanted to tell
Mm-hmm.
people how real it was, and it was very
Yeah.
difficult for me at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. And how do you then get your language up to a higher level of development? Do you like enroll in classes? Do you have to do something different?
No,
Just
I
hard
think
work?
what's interesting is just being around people who spoke Spanish all day or who spoke Spanish to me or reading emails all like I went from never speaking Spanish other than once a month when my mom would call me to
Yeah,
every single day to never reading a book or reading an email in Spanish,
yeah,
every
yeah.
second getting emails. So I just grabbed it quickly. I would say within
Mm-hmm.
2 months, my
Yeah,
Spanish had evolved from just
yeah,
practicing and hearing
yeah.
new terms and hearing people say things. I would catch on and automatically just my language became better. My Spanish is good.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can totally see that because the one thing is they always tell you, right, like it doesn't matter how much you practice the language at home, it's your second language or a third or a fourth or whatever it is. There's nothing better than actually being immersed in the culture or a place where you have to speak it all the time. And that was the same for me learning English. Like I didn't really speak English at home, but I learned it for like 10 years, only to realize that when I got to school and I had to speak English in Southern Africa, I didn't really speak English. Like I could talk a lot, but it doesn't mean that people understood what I was
Yeah,
saying. But I
yeah,
talked. I talked. That was not a problem. But within 3 or 4 months, the
yeah,
difference was really remarkable in that I had no choice. I had nobody else to speak English with. I mean, I had nobody else to speak Spanish with. So every day I had to speak English and it was exhausting, so tiring. But at the end of the day, it really worked very well and it helped evolve that language skill very easily.
yeah. I agree.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to mention, Maciel, because when I was thinking about your story of like going to Mexico, right? Even though you're very Latina, you identified as a Latina, you had this opportunity to live in Latin America for the first time, and you realize, oh, like, oh, wait a minute, like things are actually a little different, right? And I sometimes think about when we talk about undocumented people in the US who are mostly children that came here with their parents and they were very, very young. They grew up in the States, right? And without a pathway to citizenship, they always risk this. For me, is a fear
Yeah.
that they would have to go back to the country where they came from, and their experience, I imagine, would be something similar to what you were experiencing, in that they grew up in this country, they have contributed to this country their entire lives,
Yeah.
they might speak the language, but when they go back, it really isn't the place where they grew up.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate to that. And I've spoken to maybe two or three other people. They had a very similar story to me. They were first generation immigrants to Canada, actually, one of them. and very similar story. And she also had to work in Mexico in a different industry, actually, different company. And she told me, they saw me as Canadian, and I was like, I look like you, but I don't have an accent. And I remember, relating with her and saying, it happened to me too. Like, it's just, it is what it is. At the end of the day, people will know whether or not you grew up from their country, And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
yeah.
I think it's interesting because that the other thing is I have one of my cousins married a guy from Mississippi, so he's very much quote unquote American. I don't necessarily like the term because I feel American too,
Yeah.
but he's very from the United States, right? And so we went on vacation to San Andres last year with my parents. My sister flew from Australia, that's where she lives now, and she wanted to bring her husband, and her daughter is now 2, and we went to San Andres and we're like, we don't think he would like be able to handle this. This is not like, this would be too much Latin America for him. This is not the place. We can go to Cancun maybe, but
Yeah,
not
yeah.
here.
That's funny. I could see a guy from Mississippi in San Andres. He would, stand out.
Yeah. And okay, so going back to like these relocations, right? We mentioned that they're probably really great opportunities, and I could see myself doing a relocation if I were by myself, but with a family you mentioned is something totally different. You've done it twice. The second time you brought your 3 dogs, your husband and your baby with you. What have you learned from the process of going through relocations? And is there any advice that you can share with somebody that might be interested in doing it as well?
So I think I have like 2 or 3 pieces of advice. One is, don't be so hard on yourself of like figuring it all out when you arrive. It's a new country, it's a new city. It's gonna take a while for you to make friends, for you to feel at home. And when I got to Mexico, I was like, it doesn't feel like home. It doesn't feel like home. Like I miss Houston. I want to go back. And like, I had quite a bit of friends who all moved around the world for the last 20 years, and they all said, give it 6 to 7 months, give it a year. And I'm like, 6 to 7 months, like that's when I'm gonna feel okay. And they were like, yeah, it takes a while. Like, just because you move somewhere you're not going to make it home tomorrow, And so I think now if I'm going to move elsewhere, is I know it's going to take a little bit of time. And now I've been here for over a year, and I can tell you now that it's starting to feel like home, like I'm happy, I've made friends. It's like you get used to it and you can start building again that life that you had, but it does take time. So just don't rush it and don't be hard on yourself when you don't feel like it doesn't feel homey yet. It's like, give yourself time. And then the second one is, don't compare where you were before all the time. It's just be happy with where you are. You cannot change it for now. And so, I think a lot of people, and including myself at the beginning when I moved here, or when I've moved anywhere, is always like, but in Houston they had better pizza. In Houston they had better parks. In Houston, like, don't do that when you're moving somewhere. This is your new home, and just make the best of it. Go find a new restaurant. Go find what you like, and start creating those memories in this town. And so don't compare. And then I think the last one, and I will definitely do this one next time, is when we first moved here, we were moving with our luggage, our house was packed, and we were arriving with our dogs and our baby to a new city that we didn't know in an Airbnb. And so what I would do different next time is I would actually book a flight, go visit where I'm moving, go explore, go look for a place. And then I think the second time you go is a little bit easier because you know what to expect, versus we were just showing up and it was too much at the beginning. We didn't know what was a good town. We didn't know where we were going to live. There was a lot of trying to figure things out as you're also having a career and a new job that you have to deliver and perform in. So it's not like I'm like, for the next month, we're just going to find a house and we're going to find a school for my daughter. Like, no. So I would say if you could plan a little bit ahead of time and really evaluate where you're moving, ask friends, watch YouTube videos about the city, and really gather information so that when you're moving, it'll be a lot easier, versus when we arrived, we were just figuring everything out as it went, and it was harder.
Yeah. I can see how that can be really, really stressful, especially just getting to a new city, a new place for the first time.
Yes, it
Yeah,
was.
well, those are really great pieces of advice. I really like the one of, don't compare, because that really sets you up for failure.
Yes,
Really. I think it's really easy to do, but it really sets you up for failure.
it does. Yeah. And you
Yeah.
just, at the end of the day, you can't change it. Like I said, you're in a new place and you're always going to, you're usually when you're comparing things, you're comparing it to good memories. And so, but
Mm-hmm.
you're not saying, oh, traffic sucked in Houston, right? You're thinking,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you start comparing nothing but positive things, and then all you end up is just complaining, and it's just not good
Yeah.
energy to have. So I
Yeah.
would just say focus on the positive things of what you can do when you're in that new city.
I love that. And I mentioned earlier that you're a strong advocate for women in the oil field, and you do this by sharing a lot of your own experience in your social media channels. And in 2019, you co-founded your own podcast. It's called Flipping the Barrel. Tell us more about the podcast and how you got started and what you aim to achieve with it.
Yeah, so huge women advocate, not only in the energy industry, but just in STEM, in corporate. It's shocking to me the numbers that are so low in terms of percentages of women who even make it up the corporate ladder. The C level is, less than 10%. And specifically for Latinos, it's even like super sad to even look at those numbers. And so for me, it's always been a driver of sharing my experience to not only motivate and inspire other girls, but specifically Latinos that might recognize themselves in me, or immigrants who might recognize themselves in me. And so when I started the podcast, I co-hosted it with a friend, Jamie, and her and I had just recently met in Houston, and we just hit it off. It was one of those friends that you meet for the first time, and you're just like, we're gonna be best friends. And we started talking about challenges in the industry, being women in the industry. And we said, so many people talk negative about our industry from the outside world. They think oil and gas is bad, but we've had such a good experience and we love what we do. And at the end of the world needs energy and hydrocarbons. And so we decided to start the podcast to do two things. One, shine a positive light on our industry because it's needed. It's what's going to power the world. We're going to do it in a better and cleaner and safer way. But if you want to be part of the change and you care about the planet, then you should come to the oil and gas industry because this is where the change is going to happen. This is where innovation is going to happen. And we need people who are coming with those hopes of helping the planet because this is where all the technology is going to be built. And so we wanted to shine a positive light on the industry and as well as all the great career opportunities that you can have as a woman. Because many people always question me when I said I worked in the oil and gas industry where they thought it was only for men or I didn't think women would have a good career. And so a lot of misconceptions that we wanted to kind of break through the podcast. And the second thing we wanted to do with the podcast was career advice. To your point, I didn't have those parents that were C-level executives or even, who were in corporate America. So I had a lot of questions and I wanted to understand what it took to become successful. How does a woman become CEO when she has children and a husband and like how does she balance it all? Or even for men, I wanted that kind of advice. And so Jamie and I said, what if we interview the leaders of our industry who have 20, 30 years of experience, who've achieved, the top, and interview them about their career journey, ask for advice, etc. So in a way, it's like a career inspirational podcast where you get to hear from CEOs of, what it took for them to get to that position.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, I hear you talk about your own experience in the oil field and how you didn't know a lot of these things, and that's how you're learning a lot of these tips and advice. What about Jamie's experience? Was her experience similar to yours?
Yeah, so I think that's why we hit it off so well is because we both had a similar career. So I was more in the field. She was in the field for a little bit and then she did sales. But she was in the industry for 10 years and I was in the industry for 10 years kind of when we met. And we had both positive experiences where we were supported by our male colleagues. Our biggest allies were men who were supportive in our careers. We've got great opportunities and we hit it off on the fact that we wanted to showcase how great our careers had been so that other women would feel comfortable with coming to the industry or also, but her and I also shared a lot of we didn't have children at that time. So we were scared of becoming moms, and we were worried about like, what do you do when you become pregnant, and like, will your career be over, and all of these questions surrounding work-life balance, family, having children, motherhood, that we wanted to go to people who already did it and say,
Yeah.
how did you do it, so that I know I could do it. You want to see other people who've been through it, so that
Yeah.
you feel like, okay, if she can do it, I can do it. And so Jane's experience is very similar to mine, and I think that's why we hit it off quickly, and decided to do the podcast.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And, understanding that it's it's interesting that you guys said, well, let's go find the women that did it and that are moms that are doing it. Would please help me? How are you gonna do it?
Yeah, it was that, because when you look around, there's not a lot of people that look like you or who are female. And so you're thinking, maybe people like me just don't make it to that. But when you actually look, and you look at our podcast, we've been able to find quite a bit. They're just scattered around, but they're there. And
Yeah.
so when we found them, we just wanted to ask and interview them and say, how did you do it? How was your husband supportive? How was maternity leave? How blah blah blah. And we realized through interviewing all these people is that everybody has a different way. Everyone has a very different career.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I would say the number one thing is you have to have a very good partner that is supportive. If you don't have a good supportive partner, I don't think you can make it to those levels, because they all attribute their success to their partner, both men and women. So when you ask a man, they say, thanks to my wife, who did so much sacrifice for me. And then for the females who got to a high position, the same thing is their husbands took a lot of sacrifice. They left their jobs, they're stay-at-home dads, etc. I think a huge component is finding a good partner.
Interesting. I that's like a very interesting piece of like a nugget of advice that you have been able to extract. I do remember, I think the advice in general is really good. It's very interesting. I do remember one when listening to one of the episodes, and I really can't remember whom I was like who the guest was, but you guys were talking about how this person did it, and what she mentioned is that I think actually she was maybe had divorced from her spouse or something like that, and she was a single mother at the time, and she said, like, how am I going to travel so much that I have a kid and I have to leave them at home for me to go work? And somebody said, well, like, find a babysitter at school. They have been background checked. Find somebody at school that can come and stay overnight with your kid, or at church, maybe somebody can volunteer and help you with that. And so it was just a different way of finding community and finding that support that I found very creative.
Yeah, I think I remember which episode that is, but and a lot of women have said it, you have to, find a village. It does take a village to raise a child, and you have to be creative. And it's not, I'm divorced, I'm a single mom, I can't do it. It's, okay, here's a challenge, I'm going to find a solution. I'm going to hire some children, I'm going to hire teenagers, I'm going to find friends, I'm going to fly my mom in, or, do what you got to do. Use your, neighbor, church friends. To your point, you just have to get creative. But what I've learned is the people who are successful, they just don't let that stop them. You'll find a solution to get to where you want to go.
And so Flipping the Barrel has close to 90 episodes now. I think something like 89, 90, something like that. And you mentioned you've interviewed a lot of CEOs, and you have interviewed also leaders from all different organizations and all levels within those organizations. I wonder, what has been a piece of advice you have heard during these interviews that have made a difference for you?
So I've reflected back on that. There is so much great advice from people, and I think that's the beauty of these kind of either documentaries or podcasts where you get to interview people who've made it, is they give you so much valuable information that could truly make a difference. And so it's really important to hear the people who you want to become like, because they could give you a really good advice that could help you. And so for me, I think the biggest advice that we've heard on the podcast, and that I really liked because I could apply it to my life, was don't rush through your career, through life. You are always looking at the next role, the next step. the next position, the next title, and you realize life goes by so fast. It's like calm down and enjoy, like live in the moment. Because and I kind of paused and thought of my own life, and yeah, for the last 10 years was like, I want to be a field engineer so I can go into the office, so then I can become a manager, so then I can be a this and this and this. And it's like, when you actually realize, like, you should enjoy the moment and live in it, because the more you go up anyways, it's more challenges, it's more problems. It could be more money and a bigger title, but it's more stuff to deal with. And so I
Yeah.
think it's just enjoying the seasons of life. And because at the end of the day, it's not the destination, it's the journey. You know, they always say that cheesy quote, but it
Yeah.
truly is. It's enjoy every part of your career and of your life versus just focusing on that end goal. Because once you get there, it's not that great, you know?
Yeah. Right. It's a lot more work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So we always close the podcast with the same question, just to, sometimes our conversations are pretty heavy and they have to, lift it up a little bit, close it in a good mood. So our question is, imagine a friend of yours comes to visit you in your city and they want you to show them around. Like, I like to travel, but every time I travel, I like to like make it a little more local. I don't want to be just this, regular tourist walking around, but I really want some advice. And I always ask my friends, where should I go? So imagine somebody came to visit you and said, Maciel, show me around, but you're going to be in Houston, so you can't really show them around. What are some places that you would recommend for them to go to, or, things to do in a city that you want to highlight?
So any city, or it has to
Yeah.
be where I live?
No, you can do whatever you want. You've lived in a
Okay.
few different places.
All right. Well, I'll pick Montreal because it's where I grew up, and it's such a beautiful city that I truly recommend anybody listening to go for the summer. And stay downtown Montreal at the Old Port. It's what it's called, and it's kind of like a European influence. It's where there's a port, so there's ships and kind of like a little bit of like factories, like old factories, and then all of the streets are cobblestone, and there's horses with the carriages and little cafes outside, very European, like you could think
Nice.
you're in France almost.
Yeah.
And the food is exceptional in Montreal because it's such a melting pot of so many immigrants and nationalities. So you could find like Little Italy, the Greeks, the Chinese for Chinatown, the Latino Square, and so you can go all over. And there's always things to do in Montreal, specifically in the summer. There's a jazz festival. There's the Formula One. There is the Cirque du Soleil, which is like the circus
I love Cirque
outside.
du
Yeah,
Soleil.
and
Oh my gosh.
yeah, it's like there's just so much to do in Montreal, and I would suggest going to this poutine place. But so poutine, for those who don't know what it is, it's like the Canadian slash Quebec Montreal dish. It's French fries with gravy and then like curd cheese melted on top. That's what our like arepas are for
Yeah.
Montreal. Like everybody goes there and you have to try it. And so there's this place called La Banquise that do all sorts of poutines with chicken, with meat, with like all that stuff. And another restaurant that's very known is so a big foodie part of Montreal is the smoked meat. And so go get some smoked meat, some poutine, and truly you cannot go wrong with any restaurant you choose because they have great cuisine. And I could go on and on. You could do a million things in Montreal.
Oh,
I can go on and
amazing.
on. But beautiful city. Don't go in the winter. The winter sucks. It's very cold and it's snowy. So I would suggest going anytime between June and September.
Uh-huh. Oh, I haven't been to Montreal yet, so I'm gonna write down everything you said, and then next
You
time I go, I'm
have to
definitely gonna
go.
try
It's
it.
beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah. Maciel, thank you so much for joining us in the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Jennery. It was a pleasure being on, and I love what you're doing for the Latinx community. And I'm glad somebody's showcasing these stories because so many immigrants have such a great story, and I think it's very inspiring for those who are currently new to a country or trying to find their way as Latinx folks.
Yeah, yeah. We really, I think, one thing that you mentioned is that even for women in the oil field, right? You really want to make sure that people see themselves represented and that they have, it's not that there aren't women in the industry, is that there may be few, yes, but they're scattered
Yeah.
and it's hard to find them. But you've created a platform where you see those women and you see them represented, right? For us, it's similar. It's not that there aren't Latinx professionals out there working in corporations, is that they are scarce and they are scattered all over the place. And this for us is a platform where we can have them and you can find the advice from those. So I think I see those similarities, and that's why I was interested in talking to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Let me stop it.